Hey everyone, I'm going to share some tips on how to use a multi-positional hoop on your embroidery machine. Every embroidery machine has a maximum area that it can handle. For example, my machine can do 5 inches by 7 inches with its standard hoop. A multi-positional hoop gets around that in a clever way. It has more than one attachment point to your machine, so it lengthens the overall embroidery area possible. It can't make it wider, but it can make it longer. So with my multi-positional hoop, I can do a 5 by 12 area instead of a 5 by 7. A lot of my pattern pieces are bigger than the 5 by 7 area, so I really love this hoop. I'll show you how I used it to do the applique on this belly piece, which is longer than the 5 by 7 area. And before we begin, please remember to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more plush making content. So let's talk more about this hoop first. If you look on the side, it has 4 attachment points to your machine instead of the normal 2. This means that it can do 3 different 5 by 7 sections with the sections overlapping a bit. So you're going to have a connection point here, here, and here. The total area ends up being about 5 by 12 inches instead of the normal 5 by 7. Because each section can only do a 5 by 7 area, if you're going to embroider something that's longer than 7 inches, you're going to have to split up the design into different sections when you design the embroidery. Then when you execute the embroidery, you just move the hoop to a different attachment point and have your machine embroider the design made for that area. I typically use this hoop when I'm doing applique, as my plush are pretty big and some pattern pieces will extend beyond the normal 5 by 7 hoop. And while I could just re-hoop the item several times, it's much easier just to use this multi-sectional hoop instead. And this is the example that I'll talk through today. I've also used this hoop to embroider multiples of pattern pieces. So for example, I'll use it to embroider paw pads on the 2 foot bottoms. It'll have one on the top section and one on the bottom, because overall it'll take less stabilizer and you only have to hoop everything once. I haven't attempted to make an embroidery design bigger than 5 by 7 where you have to break up the stitches into multiple sections. And I'm talking embroidery like an eye and not something like applique where you're just splitting a satin stitch. I suspect that it'd be very difficult to not get a gap or a noticeable imperfection in your design if you do have to split up something like that. So I'm going to talk through how I split up my applique designs for a multi-hoop embroidery in Embird, which is the embroidery program I use. So even if you don't use Embird, you can watch this section and learn about the process. So in Embird, the first thing you have to do is select your multi-positional hoop. I'm going to click this button up here, and then click the name of the default hoop that I have in here. My hoop is this Brother Jumbo Large, which is a 5.1 by 11.8. And if you click this button here, it'll let you switch the orientation. But I'm going to keep it up and down and hit the check mark and then hit apply. So you can see these 3 different colored outlines, and that represents the 3 different positions that you can put the hoop in. So this will help you decide where to place the objects for your embroidery. The annoying thing is once you paste in a picture, which I'm going to do, and I'm just going to hit yes to paste the image and yes to make it scale to my current hoop, is that those guidelines are going to disappear. So since I want to outline the sketches of the colors that I have on here, I'm not going to know exactly where those 3 sections are going to begin and end. Another annoying thing is once you delete your image, it also still doesn't bring them back up. But you can fix this by just going back in and reselecting your hoop. The best workaround that I've found for this is to add guidelines to where your sections begin and end. These guidelines are going to add little dotted lines so that you can tell where the section begins and ends. To do that, just go up to these little guide numbers at the top until you see a cross. Click and hold and drag down until you see the line on the image, and we're just going to put them on these little colored lines here. And this is just so we can remember where they start and end. If you want to move one, you can just click on it again and drag it. If you wanted to do a vertical line for some reason, you can just do the same thing, go to the numbers on the left, click and drag and bring over a line. And that's helpful for other embroidery things as well. If you wanted to make sure something is even, you could add one of these guidelines. So now when we paste the picture in, these guidelines are going to remain so we know where the sections of the hoop begin and end. Here's the embroidery for my pattern besides the stomach applique, which we are going to cross over the two sections. And I want to use as few sections as possible for maximum efficiency. So I'm only going to be using this top section and the bottom section. So for these pieces that have already been made, I didn't do anything special for them since they're going to fall within this single 5x7 section at the top, and they don't need to be separated in any way. You would treat any piece that doesn't cross a boundary just like normal. So this belly applique is going to cross over this top section into the bottom section, and for an object that crosses, you're going to have to split it in some way. Embird won't let you have an object that crosses a boundary. So I need to split this belly applique up between these two sections. And I won't go into too much detail on how to do applique in Embird since I have an in-depth tutorial for that topic, which you could check out if you're not familiar with it. And I'll cover the very basics, but I'm not going to get too much into the specifics. In Embird, if you use the actual applique tool, which is this button right here, you have to design the satin stitch, which means that you have to place both sides of the column stitch or the satin stitch, and it's difficult to get this perfectly even across your entire object. And if I hit OK, you'll notice that it becomes shortened, and so Embird also doesn't like if you don't close off your applique object, which means that the end and the beginning meet. So if I just make a quick little box here, you'll see that it doesn't become shortened like that first one did. So because of that, I prefer to manually make my applique in Embird using the outline stitch. So the first two stitches of an applique piece will be the outline stitch that shows you where to place your fabric, and the second will be the tack down stitch, which attaches your fabric to the pieces below it. And for this, I just use the outline stitch, which is located right here. This belly piece will cross over the boundary of a 5x7 section. So how do we handle that? Well, there's a couple different ways, and I'll show you both. It also matters whether you're doing a straight stitch or a satin stitch. The first way is to manually split the object yourself. So you can just draw 3 different pieces in this case. You're going to draw one that goes down to the left of the belly just until you reach this guideline here and just a little bit before it so that you have some wiggle room. And then you would do the bottom of the belly in the bottom section, and then you have another side here. So if I were to do that, I would just start by tracing along my line that I have from my imported image here by clicking every so often where I want to place a node and then dragging the little dot between it. I'm going to end right before this guideline, and then I'm going to start another outline object. And I'm going to go above the guideline because, again, my bottom section starts up here, so I have plenty of room, and I want these two pieces to be close. They don't have to overlap and they don't have to touch, but just get them close enough. And then for my last piece, I can just copy and paste this left one and then hit transform and flip horizontally and drag it over into place. To make sure that it's perfectly even, I can select the first one. I can hit Control on my keyboard and click the right object and then hit this little transformation button up here. Click this middle tab, and this is going to align the two pieces vertically right here. But instead of drawing these 3 manually, you can also do this. You can just trace the entire object, which I will do real quick. And I'm just going to go ahead and finish this object, and then I'm going to right click and edit it. So now we want to have a node where we want to split up this object between the two sections, and there's a little circle right here, but there's not actually a node, so the little circles aren't nodes. So I can right click this circle and I can hit insert to make a node, and then I'm going to right click that square and I'm going to hit split object, and this is going to separate that blue line into 2 different objects. So I'm going to hide these previous ones to make it clearer. Now I have 2 objects. I have one that's the left side of the belly, and now I have this long one, and I can just repeat the process. I can right click, edit, and there's already a square right here, so I'm just going to right click it and hit split object, and now I have 3 pieces that are split, and it's a lot quicker than drawing them all manually, but you just have to make sure that your pieces are even. So either way you do this, now the pieces are split between the top and the bottom section. And the second way is to let Embird split up the outline for you in the editor. So for that, I would just make a single outline object for the entire stomach. So I'm just going to undo the split to save some time. So I'm going to jump ahead and show you how this gets split in the editor. I normally wouldn't do this until the very end when I'm done designing everything, but just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to save my design and hit this button to bring it into the editor. I'm just going to cancel for now because there's further adjustments that I need to make. And for some reason, Embird just likes to get rid of my long hoop. So I need to reselect it into this Brother Jumbo Large so that I can see the outlines. And now I'm going to split out this bottom stitch because it crosses the boundary. So you'll notice how there's a red outline object across this entire thing, and that means you have some objects that cross the border, and that's obvious because we were trying to handle that. So I'm just going to right click on this last stitch, which is the belly stitch, and split before item, and that's just going to single it out. And so I still have my red outline up here, which means that I'd have to do further splitting, but just to show you the auto split function, if you click your one stitch that needs to be split and right click it, go to split join and auto split, you're going to get this little pop up. And I just do this split in accordance with hoop boundary, hit OK, and then it'll ask if you want to separate objects, which matters if you have more than one stitch. I usually just hit yes. And now you can see that it's split between the top and the bottom section. So you really don't have much say over what it does besides those few options at the beginning, which aren't very useful. So if you wanted to split this in a different way for whatever reason, I would recommend just doing it manually. And sometimes I do let Embird auto split it if I'm just doing an outline stitch because it handles it just fine. But it just kind of depends on how I'm feeling and what the design is that I'm working on. So back to designing the applique. Now that I have my outline stitch, I can just copy and paste it to make my tack down stitch. So I'm just going to select my 3 separated objects. I'm going to copy and paste. I'm going to turn them into a different color so that my machine stops so I have the chance to lay my fabric down. And then I'm also going to right click, go to parameters, and shorten the stitch just a little bit. So that it's a stronger stitch than just an outline stitch, which is kind of long, but it'll be fine if you don't shorten this also. I'm going to hit OK. And now I also need to make my column stitch or my satin stitch that finishes off the edges. So there are different ways you can do this, and obviously you can do the create column object, which is just the manual satin stitch, but again you would have to actually draw your satin stitch yourself, which is going to be difficult to make it even, and I'm clearly not even trying here. But my preferred way is to just use the outline stitch to generate the satin stitch. So I'm just going to select my outline stitch, hit convert, do create column from outline, set my desired width, which I usually do 3 millimeters for applique, and hit OK. And then you have your satin stitch that's made from your outline stitch, so you know your outline stitch and your tack down stitch are going to perfectly fall in the satin stitch area. But the one thing is we need to make them overlap a little bit, and this is where the issue comes in with letting Embird auto split the satin stitch in the editor. If you do the same process of auto splitting like we did with the outline, it's going to leave a little gap similar to this. So that's why I don't like to use the auto split feature for the satin stitch. So we need to just make these overlap a little bit to compensate for the fabric pull. So I'm just going to pull up this bottom one a little bit because that top one's getting a little too close to this guideline to where I want to have more wiggle room, and I'm just going to make them overlap a little bit. And then I'm also going to go do that on this right side here. And it's okay if they overlap. You won't really see it because they'll land on top of each other when it stitches out, and it won't really be noticeable. So the final thing that I do is rearrange my objects by section over here in the right, and I did have that overall outline, so I need to delete that. I start by having everything in my top section first, so I need to move some of these objects up top. So So I'm just going to select them all, right click and drag up. And because these are applique objects, I need to do these first. So I'm going to have my applique run first, my outline stitch, and then my tack down stitch, and then my satin stitch can finish it off. And now the rest of these objects are down below, so I just need to remember to split it out at the black stitches. Unfortunately, grouping these objects doesn't work. You can group them together and bring it into the editor, but they won't stay grouped, so you're just going to have to split it out in the editor. So I'm still not going to save because I have to separate it. Once again, I have to bring up my hoop, and then I go to the black lines, and I just select the first black object here, right click and do split for item, and now they are split into the top section and the bottom section. So now I'm going to save. I'm not going to select center and hoop because that would mess up the placement. Hit OK, and then I'll just save it as this. And we're done. So now we can go ahead and execute the embroidery. So I've hooped some stabilizer in my sectional hoop, and I've just laid the first bit of fabric for my applique on the top. And I'm just going to work from the top down, so it helps to prevent wrinkles when you're doing applique if you're working from the top down, so you can kind of smooth them out as you go. So I'm just going to do the applique on the top, and then I'm going to do the applique that's going to cross over both sections. So Embird has this really helpful tool called a centering object where you can print it out, and then it helps you place your fabric on appropriately in your hoop. So I went ahead and printed that out and marked the center on my fabric so that it'll help me align everything appropriately on the hoop. So on my machine with a multi-sectional hoop, each piece will come up as its own item. So this is the top piece with the neck area, and then this is the bottom piece. So this is the part that goes on the top section of the hoop, and then this goes on the bottom section of the hoop. Unfortunately, I haven't found any way to check which position on the hoop it's supposed to go on. I don't know if I've just missed it. But I pretty much just have to remember which area of the hoop that it's supposed to go in. And so now I just have to execute the first part of my embroidery, and I have it positioned on the first two notches of the hoop, and then we're just going to get started. So now I'm at the point where it's going to run the big outline stitch that we allowed Embird to auto split. So it's just going to outline where the ivory piece is going to go, and it's going to stop when it gets to the limit of the first section. So now I have to move sections, and I have to finish the outline on the bottom. So I'm just going to lift the foot, pull up the hoop, and then move it to the bottom section here. And then I have to select the other file on my machine and run the first outline. Now I can lay my ivory fabric on top to tack it down, but first I'm going to clean up some of the extra fabric underneath here just by trimming it away. So I have my piece of ivory fabric, and I've also repositioned the hoop to be in the top because, again, when tacking down the fabric we want to go from the top down to help prevent wrinkles and bunching up. So I'm just going to slide this fabric underneath all the way to the top. And you want to double check that it's long enough and that it's going to cover all your outline stitches. And sometimes you might want to take the hoop out of the machine and lay the fabric on top because it can be easier to get the placement right. So So now I'm going to do the tack down stitch for the first section and then move on to the second section. So now that that's done, I'm just going to again reposition the hoop to go to the bottom section and select my other file. And then I'm going to run the tack down stitch. And the second time you pull up the second file, you'll have to advance the color forward. So for me, my outline stitch is the second piece of my design. And with that done, now we can trim away the excess fabric and then finish it up with the column stitches. So now we just have to do the satin stitch. I'll start with the top section since that's the one that I patterned first in my embroidery program, and then I'll do the second section. And so with the first satin stitch done, then we just have to run the second one in the last position of the hoop, and this will connect the satin stitch and finish off this object. And so here's the finished product. I did have to finish up the sides here by hand. It did go outside that 5-inch width limitation that I have on my machine, but the belly itself joined up well. The embroidery still looks nice and clean, and the lines joined together appropriately. So now I can go ahead and cut this out and use it in my plush. So I hope you guys found this helpful today, and thanks for watching. See you next time.